But we'll just have to start with a definition of what is meant by a role of a whale or whatever animal is under discussion. And here are two possible definitions that have been used sometimes to define role as a functional significance of a taxon. In our case, it would be the whales. And of the 80 species of whales or cetaceans, we are here talking about the whales, which has a somewhat different meaning in the Icelandic language. In the suborder Cetacea covers in what's termed in English all the whales, dolphins, and porpoises. In Icelandic, we call the whole lot whales, although we also speak, of course, of dolphins and porpoises. But this talk is in using the English version of the word whales, and in particular, I will limit myself to the great whales. And the talk is probably going to be also a little bit biased to the North Atlantic, which is the area that arguably is best known for these species, and also, of course, it's the area where I personally work. But on this slide, you see a lot of possible roles of whales, and I will just talk about the first two on the list, predators and prey, and you will hear more about the others later on in this seminar. So how do we approach this problem to define or investigate the role of whales as predators and prey? Here I have quoted two rather old possible questions that one could use to approach the problem. The first one is, would extinction of all whales have a noticeable effect on the function of the ecosystem? And the second one is perhaps a little bit milder. Would large variations in distribution and abundance of whales have noticeable effect on the function of the ecosystem? These are obviously not experiments that are feasible to do, just to check on the role of whales, to exterminate all whales in an area and see what happens. But historically, this experiment has been close to conducted, especially in the Southern Ocean, by the industrial whaling in the 20th century. And this graph shows the catch of the great whales between 1908 and 1980. And most of you know this story. This is one of the worst stories of overexploitation of natural resource, where close to 2 million large whales were killed in a relatively short period of a few decades. And what has this to do with the role of whales? Yes, well, there's a famous hypothesis that was put forward in the 1970s, so-called Krill surplus hypothesis. It's because in the Southern Ocean it's a rather simple ecosystem in a way, that all the large predators feed primarily on the large southern or Antarctic krill. So by eliminating so large biomass from the system, the theory states that there would be a surplus of perhaps several 100 million tons of this krill that was previously eaten by the whales, which had then become available for other predators that were not subject to the whaling. And these were primarily several species of seals, pinnipeds, seabirds, penguins and others, and then also the Antarctic minke whales, which were not subject to this large-scale whaling to the same extent. This theory was well received for a long time, but recently some scientists have cast some doubt on it, and new data have indicated that maybe the growth in these other populations wasn't all that as big as it had been, although perhaps the core essence of the theory still holds as an explanation for large increases in some pinnipeds and penguins, and perhaps also minke whales. The problem is that we don't have data track in time to verify the hypothesis. Of course, we had a similar story to tell from the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, with overexploitation that took the same species, different populations of these species down. And that began earlier in the North Atlantic in the 1860s. But when we look at these figures, I don't know if it's self-explanatory, but this is showing for the fin whale, and this is the sei whales. And these are the stock trajectories from 1920 to 2000, or 1930. And the black color here shows the southern hemisphere. So you see in the beginning of the period, by far the largest stocks were there. And today, or when this was done in 2007, they are only a very small fraction of pre-exploitation abundance, while the red color for the Pacific and the green color for the North Atlantic, there's not much difference in the status today than it was at the beginning of this period, and a roughly similar graph for the sei whales. So when talking about the roles of whales today, we have to bear this in mind, that in the Southern Ocean, this is also another visualization of this, that the roles, whatever they were, are being fulfilled to a large extent, depending on biomass in the North Atlantic today as they were in 1920, to a lesser extent in the North Pacific, but particularly in the Southern Ocean, where original stock sizes are over 300,000 fin whales. There's only a very small portion of them today. So there we have the roles once played by all these fin whales are perhaps played differently by some other species now. And this is just similar graph for the sei whales. So if we now turn to the North Atlantic, here I list the main species of large whales in the North Atlantic, their estimated abundance today, and something about their feeding strategy and feeding ecology. And we see that today we have stills in the North Atlantic, some whale species that are still very depleted, like the blue whale, and the bowhead and the right whale are highly depleted still in the North Atlantic, while the balenopterids are either close to recovery or having fully recovered. And these are the same numbers expressed in biomass, and there the fin whale is by far the species of baleen whales with the highest biomass in the North Atlantic, and minke whale, humpback whales, and sperm whales have considerably less. So in order to estimate the role of the species, we need data that we in most cases have too little of, but these are the basic data that we would need to simply categorize the potential role based on biomass and interactions. And of course we need information about the abundance of the species, which we get from sighting surveys to get the population size, and then the body size of individuals. And when we calculate this together, we get the biomass that I just showed for the North Atlantic. Then we need information on migration, because these large baleen whales, they are migratory and migrate between two different ecosystems. They spend the summers feeding in high latitude areas, and then they spend winters in the breeding areas, which in many cases are unknown today. But in the feeding areas, like for example around Iceland, they are believed to take up to 80% of the total yearly food in maybe 4 to 6 months. So the potential roles of whales in these two ecosystems would then be highly different during summer and winter. And of course, we would also need information on diet composition. And then all these factors should ideally be put into as an input to ecosystem modeling. If we take a look at the global take on rough calculations of whale consumption or cetacean consumption in the world, just coarsely divided by crustaceans, cephalopods, and fishes, because in most cases we don't have any more detailed data on diet. We see that in total, the total consumption of all cetaceans is in excess of 300 million tons. And compared to fishery, it's more than 3 times the total fishery at this time. This is from the graph from the 1990s. But if we look only at the fishes in this graph, the fisheries are slightly higher than the cetaceans in what they take from the system. And if we divide this by areas and between baleen whales and all cetaceans, what sticks out quickly is the southern hemisphere consumption of krill, which stands out here. But here we have compared this with the fisheries, and we see that in all the areas, the fisheries take more fish out of the area than any of the other ocean. But in considering all cetaceans, it's of the similar order of magnitude. But considering only baleen whales, they take much less fish. But this was a global and ocean basin overview. Things look quite different if you consider an individual ecosystem within ocean basins. And here are 6 examples of these with the consumption of mammals shown in this color here. And the fishery is always the largest. Well, this is fish flow biomass through the system. And in all cases, most of the fish is taken by other fish, as you see here. But considering the marine mammals, we see from these 6 systems that they are by far highest in the Barents Sea. But there's also considerable amount of fish consumed in the Bering Sea and George Bank and the Benguela Current, while it's very little in the North Sea. And in the northern ecosystems, marine mammals often play major roles, like this one in the Barents Sea, where we see that, again, compared to fisheries, we have minke whales consuming similar levels as the fisheries, and even more consumption is taken by harp seals, and cod is the highest consumer of this system. So then if we turn to the central North Atlantic, this is an old figure also from the 1990s. This is the Icelandic and adjacent waters, consumption of 12 species of cetaceans. And here, minke whales and fin whales stick out. Fin whales are primarily eating krill, as you see by this color, while minke whales are about 50-50 krill and fish. And the total consumption by these cetaceans is around 6 million tons, and about 2 million tons of these is estimated to be fish. But then again, all these numbers should not be taken too literally. It's rather order of magnitude or kind of a crude estimations. But still, they give some indications about the potential role of whales in the systems. And here are these same numbers have just been put into context with the fisheries again. So all cetaceans in Icelandic and adjacent waters are believed to consume maybe 4 to 6 times the amount taken by the fishery. And fin whales and minke whales, each species is of the same order of magnitude as the fishery. One more example from the Icelandic. This is from Hjalmar Vilhjálmsson, our cabling specialist at the Marine Research Institute. And this is the graph from him about the predation of capelin, and we see that the whales are taking quite a portion of the cake in this graph, but also cod and other fishes are also quite big in this picture. And the fishery these three are the main predators on capelin, so to speak. And again, these are data from the 1990s, and this was during a low cod years, so probably cod is underestimated in this figure. So, but ecosystems are not stationary, and these figures I've been showing from the 1990s may look somewhat different today, and how quickly they can change, and the role of whales that will change in a short interval is demonstrated by a study we did on the minke whale recently. First, I will show here that this is showing the decrease in sand eel abundance in Icelandic water around the turn of the century. There was a big drop in abundance of sand eel around the country, and at around the same time we were analyzing minke whale stomachs, and we see a very significant drop in the proportion of capelin in the stomachs, and from almost 100% in the beginning in South Iceland to close to 10% just in the course of around 5 years. And this was compensated by increased consumption of herring. And in North Iceland we had a similar decreased sand eel compensated by krill and also by catfish to some extent. But these were not the only changes concerning minke whales seen in this the first decade of the 20th century. We also see that quite a drastic decrease in the abundance of minke whales on the continental shelf in Icelandic waters. So in 2001 we had around 40,000 minke whales in this area, but by 2009 it had fallen to around 10,000. So minke whales have obviously responded both by switching diet, as we saw, and also by just simply leaving the country for some better place. At around the same time, and actually well before, we had been seeing increase in humpback whale abundance since we started counting whales in 1987. By then, the situation between minke whales and humpback whales on the continental ground was about that the minke whale biomass was about twice the biomass of humpback whales in 1987. By 2001, even if both had increased, humpback whales had increased much more and had become double the biomass of minke whale in this area. And then after the decrease in minke whale, the biomass of humpback whale is maybe fourfold the biomass of minke whale. So here, the humpback whales seem to have taken over the role of minke whales to some extent. Of course, all these consumption estimates and things, they don't tell us much exactly about the role of whales, and for that we need much more precise information and modeling on the interactions. And this is best done by multi-species modeling, and here I just list the three types of models that are mostly used in these of varying complexity. And here are just some few examples of results. Maybe all the exercises done to date have in common that there's a large uncertainty. The data deficiency is very high in most cases, and the outcome is surrounded by a very high degree of uncertainty. But what has been concluded with reservations about uncertainty is, for example, two studies, one in West Africa and one in the Caribbean Sea, where it was concluded that it was if the aim was to revive the fish stocks and re-establish the fish stocks, it was much more profitable to close the fisheries temporarily to build up the fish stocks rather than to cull all the whales in the area. This was a study by Morissette et al. On using ecosystem modeling. And here is a case study in the North Atlantic, Central North Atlantic, where a decreased cod and capelline yield was predicted with an increase in 3 species of baleen whales. Some studies on modeling of the Barents Sea have concluded that, similar to in the Icelandic area, that with increasing marine mammal abundance would result in a decreased cod yield, but there the direction of the size changes was unknown for the capelline. But in the most recent Norwegian studies have actually indicated a new thing that I hadn't seen before from other areas, that the growth of the cod, at least the authors of the papers claim that the recent growth in cod stocks in the Barents Sea appears to have had negative effects on the marine mammals in this area, mainly the seals and minke whales, in the body condition, and the authors concluded that this is because of competition with the cod. So, just a few slides about the role of whales as prey. It's of course well known that man has been for a long time a predator on whales, and but we'll in the seminar we keep him out of the picture. And apart from man, killer whale has traditionally been viewed as the only significant predator on large whales in the ocean. There are some accounts of false killer whales and even pilot whales harassing and attacking large whales, but there are not any sure reports about them really carrying it out in full and consuming whales. And also there are some accounts of sharks, but these are mainly on the smaller cetaceans like dolphins and porpoises. It's well known that the sharks take these small cetaceans to some extent. And there are also recent reports of associations between sharks and killer whales. When killer whales are attacking large whales, the sharks will hang around and take advantage of the bites that come from the killer whale. The killings. And this picture on this is from 2008 in Icelandic waters of Skjálfandi, where a killer whale group came into the fjord and teared apart a minke whale just in front of whale-watching tourists. So that was quite... Also in connection with the potential role of the large whales as prey is the so-called theory of sequential collapse caused by killer whale predation. This is a theory that is still being debated, and it's controversial still. But the theory really states that there was in the North Pacific, in the latter half of the 20th century, there was a sequential collapse on some large predators, like harbor seals, fur seals, sea lions, and sea otters, one after the other, that the populations crashed. And the theory is basically so that the killer whales have for a long time relied to an extent on large whales, and the reduction in large whales from whaling reduced the availability of these whales to the killer whales to an extent that they had to switch to other prey. And this happened so abruptly that the big quick killer whale stocks, one after other, would take down these other marine mammals. But and this is a theory that's still in the debate, and there's a wide range of opinions for and against it, whether it holds. Some recent research actually questions the sequential nature of these collapses and such maybe. So just to conclude, the role of prey is very uncertain. The role of whales as prey is quite uncertain. It is probably important locally. There are some recent articles from Australia where predation of killer whales on humpback whale calves seems to be quite significant, with increasing population size of humpback whales. A large group of killer whales come there every year, and there are numerous accounts, and to an extent that it might be important on a population level. Also it is well known that the gray whales in the Pacific, also the young of the year primarily, are taken off Alaska on the first year, the first migration, by a pod of 270 killer whales that come there every year at this time of the year. And it has been postulated that they may take as much as half of the calf production. So at least locally, it seems to be could be important on a population level, the role as prey. But in the role as a predator, it can be concluded that just by biomass, that in some ecosystems, whales are quite significant part of the ecosystems, and they consume very big amounts in some ecosystems, but it's very variable between areas of the world. And I have also emphasized the very big difference between the North Atlantic and the Southern Ocean about the status of whales. So as predators, it is likely that they play a very significant role, but the details of these roles are difficult to evaluate at the present stage by multi-species modeling because of data deficiency. And then the future climate changes, which are still already ongoing, are still further complicating this evaluation. But for ecosystem modeling, to clarify this role better, we need much more input for most of the species. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Yes, so I would like to start my talk today by defining biomimicry. And it's been defined as the imitation of model systems and elements of nature for the purpose of solving complex human problems. And I will take some examples. And the old example is from Leonardo da Vinci, his drawings of what he called flying machines that was inspired by flying birds, and later on, of course, to our airplanes today. And some maybe on a smaller level or smaller scale, we have the picture there of a burr, and that's Velcro was inspired by the tiny hooks found on the surface of burrs. And also we have examples from like the spider web silk. It's as strong as Kevlar, and it's used in bulletproof vests. And a lot of robots are inspired by the locomotion of animals. One is the bionic kangaroos that jumps and save energies in that way. Or we are also inspired by geckos, by the locomotion and how they can climb up and down of walls. But even from the whales, we have examples. And there's a company called Whale Power, and they are inspired by the flippers from the humpback whales. They have these irregular bumps called tubulets, and it reduces the drag for the humpback whales, but for the wind turbines, it also makes them more efficient. And the animals, they also use different senses than we do as humans. And one example is the echolocation, like the flying mammal, the bats. And the echolocation for bats that was first described by Donald Griffin in 1958 in his book, Listening in the Dark. And a few years after that, Ken Norris, he described echolocation in dolphins for the first time, and it was in a paper published in 1961, an experimental demonstration of echolocation behavior in the porpoise Tursiops truncratus. And since then, we have conducted a lot of different studies of the echolocation behavior of bottlenose dolphins. And many of these are summarized in this book by Whitlow Au, The Sonar of the Dolphins. And the bottlenose dolphin, they emit short duration clicks with a peak frequency around 120 kilohertz. So that's above our hearing. We as humans can only hear up to 20 kilohertz. And I've also recorded the echolocation clicks of white-beaked dolphins, one of the earliest studies I did in Iceland in Faxaflóa Bay. And they use similar clicks as the bottlenose dolphins, but they have another peak around 250 kilohertz. And I'll just, before I play it, I will just refer to the other figure that was also conducted in Faxaflóa Bay. And we found that the echolocation clicks of the white-beaked dolphins, they were louder further away from the target they were looking at. So we found this nice relationship between the range and the target the dolphins were looking at. But I'll just play the sound, and it's slowed down so you can hear all the clicks. I will not play all of them, but that study for this high frequency peak around 250 kilohertz, then we were wondering if the dolphins actually could hear these very high frequency, because bottlenose dolphins, they can only hear up to 150 kilohertz. And for that we needed an animal to measure the hearing, and they are not in captivity. So we went out and were in touch with Jeff Foster and with HoopNet. We were catching the white-beaked dolphins here in Faxaflóa Bay when they were bow riding. And then we had a custom-made tank, and we brought the dolphin to the tank and had it there for a few hours while we were doing the hearing test. So we had suction cup electrodes on the head of the animal, and then we played sound in different frequencies, and then measured on the behavior or the brain activity if the animal could hear the sound or not. And so that's the audiogram to the right. So the white-beaked dolphin, it could hear up to 181 kilohertz, but it did not hear the 215 kilohertz. So still a little higher than bottlenose dolphins, but not as high as the sound they produce. And this is another study. I've done another tooth whale, but now we are in Greenland for the narwhal whale. And that was a study funded by the Office of Navy Research, and together with the Greenlandic Institute of Natural Resources. We stayed on it's called Nierønet in the western part of Greenland, a small village with only 42 people living there. And then we went out with a helicopter and searched for narwhals. This was in the winter in March, so it was -20, -30 degrees. And then we were just searching for narwhals. So for opening in the pack ice and searching for narwhals. And when we found them, then we would land on the pack ice with the helicopter, set up the recording equipment, and then record the sound from the narwhals. And this is the results from what we found. So both the narwhals, they made the similar clicks as the white-beaked dolphins, also these high-frequency clicks up to 200 kilohertz. But then we also looked at the echolocation beam, how broad or how narrow it was, and it was very narrow. So it's actually the most directional echolocation beam of what we have described for any animal so far, with a 3 dB beam width of only 5 degrees. And then you can wonder why that is. But maybe it is an advantage for an animal when they are coming from deep down and have to find the opening of the water, that they look in a very narrow beam and not get the big echoes from the ice. And then I'll just jump back to us as humans, because I talked about echolocation. And so we developed fish finders, and it was first developed in 1948 in Japan, the commercial fish finders. And even today, I know from Simride sonars, they are multi-beam sonars, they are still looking to dolphin echolocation and their ability. And we still have not made as good as a human-made sonar as the dolphin echolocation, or as the dolphin sonar. And this is an example for the killer whales, the biggest dolphin, and they also echolocate, but not as high frequency as the other dolphins. So it's only up to 50-60 kilohertz. And this I recorded in Westman Islands together with Philippa. I don't know if she's here today, Philippa Samara, but I'll just play that as well. And also that fits for the killer whales. If you look at their audiogram, we do have killer whales in captivity, so it's a bit easier to measure the hearing of them. And they have best hearing there around 50 kilohertz, or similar as the echolocation. But then also it has been reported first by Malene and Simon. They also did recordings around Westman Islands. They recorded these 683 hertz pulse when the killer whales were feeding. And last year, Philippa Samara published this paper with 50 to 270 hertz signals. And this, I'll just play this from Philippa. And it has been suggested that these low-frequency sound, they are then used to herd the herring together. So these are frequencies that the killer whales produce that are below what they can hear. But the animals, the herring, they are hearing it. So with David Mann and others, they published the audiogram from herring, and they hear under 1,000 hertz. So it makes sense for the killer whales to use these herding sounds. So I was talking about toothed whales. Now I will jump to baleen whales. And first by photo identification. These are blue whales, photographs from Skjaldbrendi Bay, from Husavik. And together with many students, we are reporting or taking photo identification picture every summer when they come into the bay in June. And as you see on the pictures, the blue whales, they have different patterns on their skin, and it's easy to recognize in this way when you match the pattern. And from after last season, we now have 172 different blue whales that's been coming into Skjaldbrendi Bay for the last 10 years. And if you remember from Gisli's talk, we have maybe 1,000 to 2,000 blue whales in the North Atlantic. Then 172 animals is quite a lot that we get in Skjaldbrendi Bay. But we can also ask the question, how do the baleen whales find their way? And that's one of the questions that we don't know the answer to. But it has been suggested that they can use magnetic field, like the birds, that they can find their way that way. Or they could use passive acoustics, so they can listen to the environment. and like to the sea mountain, and that way learn how to find their way, or maybe use active acoustics. And I'll just, as an example, play the sound of blue whales recorded in Skjaldvangi Bay. So now we are on the other end of the scale, very low frequency. They make sound below 20 hertz, but in Skjaldvangi Bay it's usually downsweep around 50-40 hertz. So this example is then speeded up. And for that, we were interested in looking at also how loud the sound is from the blue whales. And this was a study funded by the German Environmental Agency. We did in the summer 2015, and we used these 4 boats, and we had them all out on the same time. And then we had a hydrophone array with a hydrophone from each boat at a depth of 30 meters. And then for the difference in arrival time of each hydrophone, we could calculate how loud the sound was. So it's 185 to 190 decibel. And it's similar to what's been reported elsewhere in the world. And that study led to this new study we are going to do this summer, also funded by the German Environmental Agency, that we're going to test from this loudspeaker. It's similar to what's called a marine vibrator, and they can make this very low frequency sound. And we tested it in Keflavik Harbor in October, and it works fine. So it weighs 800 kilo, and we lower this below the surface and then play like signals to the right that are simulating blue whale sound. And then we want to see how the blue whales are reacting to this sound. This loudspeaker has been developed from the industry instead of using air guns that can be very loud. So if this would work, it will have much less impact on the environment. Another question is how do the baleen whales find their prey? And we can have some of the same answers as before. Do they use passive acoustics or active acoustics? And there's an old study by Whitlow Au again that from the snapping shrimps, that they make, it's very loud, the sound is source level of 185 dB, so it's similar level as the blue whales as you saw before, that this tiny animal can make so loud sound. I'll just play it as well. And we have got like recordings of something that sounds like that from Icelandic harbors, but I assume snapping shrimps are not here, but some other crustaceans probably. And for the echolocation, then there's one paper by Alison Stimpert, and they got these recordings of what they call megap clicks, that possibly humpback whales are using echolocation for finding the prey. And this is the file from her paper. But so far, this is still controversial, and it hasn't been documented from other studies. So it's still to be proven. And what do these baleen whales hear then? We still don't know. And this is a model from Dorian Hauser et al. For humpback whales, and based on the anatomy of the inner ears, and they came up with that they have a best hearing around 5 kilohertz. But actually that was something we wanted to find out, and then now it's already 10 years ago and we still don't have the answer. So I'll play a short video of our attempt on that time that didn't succeed, because I never played this video in Iceland, so I thought it would be nice for you to see it.
Absolutely. This is a very large animal, and big so minke whales that you work nicely for those. Very complicated, this structure. Chains here to make minor adjustments once the animal's in place.
I'm going to start out with these suction cups here. And the suction cups have a little gold sensor in them, the same sensor that you use to measure EEGs in humans. And essentially what it does is it kind of sticks onto the animal, or sticks onto them, and you play the sound to them. And if the brain responds to that sound, then you can measure the brain's response, which is these little electrodes here.
Satellite transmitter. During this coming year, you get information every day about the movements and the diving behavior. And this way you have an extraordinary idea about what these whales are actually doing out here. Down here. Whales, beautiful minke whales on a lovely day in Iceland. Oh, there's one. You see it?
That's the second one there. This is one more from here. Hey, boy.
So we're back out again looking for whales, and it's going to be a great day. I can feel this one in the air. We don't know where they are. It's been about 4 minutes since they came up, so we're trying to keep an eye. They're outside the net. They're outside the net. There they go.
Yeah, we're 30 and we start out of the We're gonna do it.
Next time we'll get them. Next time.
Yes, so that's still to be done. So for that we rented this Persane vessel, the Sulan, and I mean we were not successful, but the fishermen, they are sometimes successful in at least catching the humpback whales in the nets. So we have been at some point hoping for that we could do this experiment with one of the whales they would get in their nets. And so this is an example I got from one of the Persane fishermen with a humpback whale in his net. And that actually led to the PhD project that Charla Bastran is doing. She's based in Husavik, and she's looking at the photo ID and scar analysis of the humpback whale. And also she's doing surveys of fishermen, and especially with the Caplin fishery case study. And finally we're also doing some acoustic pinger testing. And these pingers, this one developed from Australia called a whale pinger. They were supposed to be developed to scare whales away from nets, as the drawing can see. And we are doing this experimental test off Husavik right now, actually. But besides the whale pinger, because it's not very loud, we are also trying some seal scarer, because they are much louder than the whale pinger. And we have also put different kind of tags on humpback whales, acoustic tags, and not only the acoustic tags, also under video camera tags, and that's been together with this Japanese team. And I just wanted to play a little of the video also. But like in Skjaldbandi, the underwater visibility is not that great, so it's probably only the upper 30 meters where you can actually see something. But what she did, so this was Yu Akimaya, she's doing that for her PhD project, and what she did find was that because we get all the dives and all when the humpback whale is doing launch feeding, and what she did see was that the foraging behavior was different if other animals were around, and these other animals could be other humpback whales, but also if there was dolphins within the view of the camera. So then maybe the foraging was disrupted, or we don't know why, but at least there's a difference in their foraging behavior if they are alone or if other animals are around. And for other animals, I mean, that can of course also be birds. It's been a long history with the association between birds and whales, and one of the old papers in 1988 from Perotti, where he described like these 5 types of associations. So they can be type A, where they are close together, but they do not appear to interact, or type B, where cetacean and birds are attracted to the same source, but do not show any positive attraction to each other, or type C, that birds that appear to be optically drawn to marine mammals, and that example, I guess we often use, that the whales are chasing the fish to the surface, and then it's easier for the birds to catch the prey. Or is the type D, where birds scavenging by byproducts of marine mammals, and also type E, where marine mammals are predators of seabirds. And in this case, I guess it's especially killer whales we're talking about. And Pia Andersen, she published this paper on minke whales a few years ago, and then looking at the different bird species and how, like, who's coming first. Sometimes the birds are before the whales in an area, and sometimes the other way around. So they are like they can be the initiators, or the joiners, or catalogs. So they have different roles, the different in the association between seabirds and whales. And for the seabirds, we don't know how they are finding the prey either, and what they hear, we don't know what they hear either, like the auks and the puffins. So this we are going to study this summer. We got funded from the Office of Navy Research to conduct the study on the hearing. So just similar as with the white-beaked dolphin, we will put electrodes on the head of the animals and play a sound, and then see if the birds can hear the sound or not. And then maybe in the future we can then tell if the puffins can hear the prey, or how it works. This was my last slide, so thank you for your attention. And I wanted to mention also for the tagging work, we thank North Sailing for lending us the Zodiac, and also Gentle Giants in 2012 and 13. Then they were lending us their Zodiac for the tagging project. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jon, and thank you all for coming today. I really enjoyed the earlier presentations. I'm going to start by taking a step back in a moment, but first I want to thank Rebecca Owen from the U.S. Embassy Sigurstein Mason, close enough, I hope, from IFA for helping put this together. I got the invite a couple of months ago and was very excited. This is my first trip to Iceland, not my last. I'll be coming back in another month or two for vacation. And I also want to thank Gisli and Marianne for helping arrange this, and everyone else today. I was just saying outside that a couple of years ago, one of the hardest things I did was I went to Brazil and I gave a lecture in Portuguese. And then I gave it in English, and I found that the lecture in Portuguese, even though I really don't speak it very well, went much better because the audience was with me. So today I'm going to try and give my talk in Icelandic. Para grín. Does that work? No. Just kidding. Okay, so as I'd said, we're going to try, I'm going to start off taking you back a little bit, getting a broad picture, and then we'll talk about some of the topics that Gisli and Marianne started today. So for much of human history, this is all we would have seen of a whale. You'd be on the shore, you might see a spout that could be 10 meters high, the glisten on the back, and for the most buoyant whales like right whales or humpback whales, you'd see a fluke and it would sink. In a way, it's kind of a metaphor for the oceans in general. We only really understood that surface level for a long time, even for biologists. Most of our studies of the oceans have been on the surface. But of course, it's really most of the whale's life and most of life in the ocean is beneath the surface. Because we didn't know what was going on beneath the oceans, there was lots of speculation and ideas of what species might be beneath the sea. This is based on the map by Olaus Magnus, one of the early maps of Scandinavia. And you can see several of the species or animals that he proposed for that ocean system. Up on the upper left, and I think of any species, any of those early depictions where you see a spout could represent something like a leviathan, a cetacean, or what we're going to talk about today, whales, great whales in particular. I find of special interest this one on the lower right. You can see the spout indicating it's some kind of a whale, but you also see, you squint, that there are claws there. That's based on a mistranslation from Swedish into Latin. Some cleric apparently had mistranslated the word fins into claws. And even though no one ever saw this animal, it persisted in French natural history and other books for hundreds of years. In fact, I noticed when I looked at an early depiction of Iceland before coming here. And you can see him, it shows up there too. So this idea, this speculation, we'll find that in a lot of times in the oceans. It's not just hundreds of years ago, but our ideas of the oceans are changing and starting from just really in the past couple of decades. So there were two ways that we could learn more about whales, right? Beyond looking off into the ocean when we were mostly land-based, and one is through strandings. I'm going to try my one Icelandic word, Hvalir. Is that right? Beach, so like a stranded whale, that word? Okay, got it, close enough. So this is one image from the Netherlands from the early 1600s. It's a sperm whale. You can see it, the fascination that people had even then. For some communities, of course, it was whales when they stranded were sources of food. For others, it was more fascination. So here we have a sperm whale, and at least several hundred years ago in Western Europe, a whale stranding could be a sign that something's wrong with God's universe, God's order, because you have a large sea creature coming onto land. So up on the left, there's Father Time. The sand is just about run out in his hourglass, and then there's a solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse. So different interpretations of what happens when a whale shows up on the shoreline. Of course, the other deep way that we have a connection to whales is through whaling. As far as I know, this is the earliest image we know, human image, drawing of a whale. It's from a petroglyph in Korea from 4,000 years ago. Probably, just because these are the coastal species that are there, probably depicting a gray whale or a right whale. The slow coastal species, first ones really to be hunted. And there's good reason why we were focusing on marine mammals and why today we're talking about great whales. Then when I use the word great whales, this isn't a scientific term. It's based on size. It's the baleen whales, but it also includes the sperm whales, which are odontocetes, not filter feeders. But because of their great size, they're included there. So why do we care about them? Well, historically, before we started systematic hunting, they comprised 90% of the marine mammal biomass. And that's part of the reason why today I'll be talking about great whales in particular. A lot of the general ideas I'm going to be talking about could apply to smaller odontocetes as well. And you can see from this slide, they're highly migratory as well. And we'll talk about why that matters, why the migratory patterns of these species plays into our thoughts. Gisli showed a variation of this slide earlier today, so I don't need to say much more about it, but it shows you on the upper left the different species that were hunted by many countries, mostly in the northern hemisphere, in the 20th century, and the serial depletion of species, starting at least in the 20th century with the blue whales working their way down to fin whales to smaller species, the result being a depletion of about 85% of all great whales. The biomass over that time declined by about 85% over the course of about 200 years. So in the late 1990s, I worked in Japan doing some work on the genetics of whale meat, of meat that was getting onto the marketplace at that time. And so I was a graduate student, I was a master's student working there. And at that time, part of the justification of whaling was, one, that it was competition with fisheries. Japan still has this on their website. And the other, perhaps for conservationists of more concern, is that they may be affecting the abundance of other whales. So you see blue whales, fin whales, and sei whales up top. Japanese were claiming that because of an abundance of minke whales, they were restricting the recovery of these other species. Okay, so that's sort of what's in my mind, late 1990s. I'm in graduate school. And then I'm sitting, probably like some of you in the back of the class, of marine ecology, my marine ecology class, and I learn about this idea of the biological pump. Those of you who are teaching or study oceanography are well familiar with this. The idea, of course, is phytoplankton. Photosynthesis is only occurring near the surface where there's enough light. And that phytoplankton is either sinking or being consumed by zooplankton or by fish, and there's a net movement of organic matter towards the ocean floor. That's the biological pump. And while I was sitting in the back of the class, I thought, well, actually, my observations on the oceans as a whale biologist are just a little bit different from that biological pump. Something's missing here. A couple of years ago, we insulated our attic, and I found my notebook from that class. And even then, I put this little drawing here, kind of hard to see. But when I'm out on the water studying right whales are diving down in the Bay of Fundy off the coast of Nova Scotia. They come up with mud on their heads. They're surfacing, breathing, resting, digesting, and then typically when they dive, they put out a big fecal plume. So I was thinking, maybe there's something to this. If whales are actually going the opposite direction, they're bringing nutrients up to the surface. One, can we measure those nutrients? And two, is it ecologically relevant? To use the term that Patrick used earlier, is it ecologically relevant, or is it a fart in a hurricane? Okay, so what's the word? I don't think, what's the word in fart in Icelandic? What's that? Okay, so is it ecologic? Does it matter, or is it really just a herring fart, right? Nothing, something that doesn't really have an effect on the ocean. So we looked at that, and here's an illustration of that pumping. So whales are diving, not always, but many whales are diving beneath the euphotic zone, in the dark zone, where they're feeding on prey, coming to the surface, exhaling, and also releasing those nutrients. So in contrast to the biological pump, you're seeing this net movement of nutrients to the surface. Again, okay, we see that, we observe that, but how ecologically important is it? So we looked at the Gulf of Maine. We looked at the sort of the same models that Gisli was using for consumption. We did those consumption models for whales, seabirds, and seals. But even now, with whale populations down, their biomass vastly outweighs the biomass of seals and seabirds, which are also moving these nutrients. We focus on this whale pump idea because they're most of the biomass in these oceans at that time. What we found is that just in that one area alone, and we're looking at nitrogen in the system because that's the limiting nutrient in this area. Others have looked at iron, and we're increasingly looking at phosphorus as the three nutrients that might be relevant here. But you can see it right there. So there you see the rivers. Whales actually bring more nitrogen into that system than all the rivers combined. And almost as much as coastal point source. What's that? Human sewage. But not as much as atmospheric deposition. That's still, but the difference between the way whales are putting out these nutrients and atmospheric deposition is that tends to be pretty uniform. Whales, of course, are bringing those nutrients into areas of high productivity. So we submitted this paper, and frankly, we got rejected on our first try. No scientist would be surprised at that. But one of the rejections, and actually it might have been two, said, well, you guys, so I was at Harvard at that time, you guys are right there on the coast, and you're looking at this. Why aren't you going out and collecting it? Like, you guys, and it's like, oh, no. So now there's a whole nother project. We thought we were done, and really we just started. So we decided, okay, they're probably right. Let's go out onto the coastline. Let's go out on the water and try and collect this so we can find the nutrients in these fecal plumes and see if our estimates for nutrients and nitrogen and other nutrients were true. So we were quickly quoted as this was quoted as being one of the worst jobs in science in Popular Science magazine, whale feces researcher. Any of you guys that follow whales around, it's not really that bad of a gig. I can think of some others, like folks that I know that study Lyme disease, which is transmitted by ticks, and they use man-bait. So think about going out in the field and attracting as many ticks as you can and then counting them. I would definitely take following a whale around any day. But there is a problem, and this is work from colleagues of mine in New England Aquarium, in that it's, any of you guys, I know some of you are whale watchers, work in the whale watching industry, you don't see it a lot. You need to follow a whale around a lot. So we decided, how could we optimize this? And this was work by Roz Rolland and others at New England Aquarium. They thought maybe we could use sniffer dogs. So this is Fargo, 90-pound Rottweiler, who started out his career as a companion dog, living with an elderly woman. After she died, he became a drug-detecting dog in a prison in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest. And then I think he landed what I would expect for many dogs would be a dream job, which was a detective dog for wildlife, for scats, for grizzly bears and other animals in the Pacific Northwest. Roz Rolland thought, well, if it works on land, maybe it'll work on the sea. The problem for dogs on land, any of you who've ever watched a dog follow, they're sallying up a scent cone, right, is that there are trees, there are hills, so the scents can disappear and appear around while they're traveling through landscape. On the ocean, you wouldn't have that, but you have currents, and you can't go, the dogs can't run on the water, so they're reliant on the driver to find these. Despite those obstacles and the fact that Fargo got seasick, so we had to take Dramamine before I went out every time. Fortunately, the owner was a vet, so she knew how to do that, and his colleague was Bob, and Bob was terrified of whales. So anytime a whale came up near the boat, he would cower underneath there. He retired early. Fargo still had a couple of years. But it's pretty amazing. So Fargo, working at sea, and someone earlier asked, how do we collect these samples? There's a plankton net on the upper left there. So we're collecting the samples with a plankton net. You can see the scent cone here. That the black square there is where Fargo hits a mark, and he's excited. And Rottweilers don't have big tails, which is typically how you tell a dog is excited. We called it the happy inch, or how would you translate that? The happy 2 centimeters when he was on a sample. He hits it. He's excited. When you see an X, it means he's off the scent. So you're out of that scent cone. And then you see the box again. He's on it. And you're working your way up. And we hit that at a nautical mile away. So almost 2 kilometers away, he's smelling this and finding these samples, really enhancing our ability to go out in the field and find samples. I do this for nutrient analysis. The folks at the New England Aquarium were doing it to look at hormones and to look at toxins. And afterwards, we've been looking at the microbiome of the whale using this technique. And also, as it turns out, one way to find whale feces is in courtship groups, especially in right whale courtship groups. So here you see a North Atlantic right whale group, female in the center, males around it. I think the lighting's hard to see here, but there are actually fecal plumes in that area. So this actually is probably the best way for us to find samples. Lots of active whales, lots of floating feces in that area. And just because people often ask, the whale feces varies by species and by diet. So for some species, it kind of looks like a green tea, an oversteeped green tea. For others, you can see those clumps there. So it really depends what species what species it is and what they're eating. So we did that analysis of those samples, and the good news is we found very high levels of ammonium, much higher than background rate, and also that the ammonium concentrations were increasing over time when we did incubations either on ship or shore. And then we incubated those samples in water samples that were taken from the nearby bay, and did incubations with and without whale feces and found higher levels of primary productivity, helping to close this loop. And yes, I mean, to Giesli, we do see elevated primary productivity from this. Whether we see higher fish populations is still something where I'm not prepared to say that, though I'll take not credit, but if I said that I don't want to blame the journalist. If I said that, that's my bad. But we believe that's true. We just haven't gotten that far. So why does this matter? Well, it especially matters in the summertime, where this would be a familiar pattern to any of you that have studied oceanography. In the winter, you have lots of mixing, and nutrients are more or less uniformly spread throughout the system. But in summer, you have a thermocline that forms. The upper warm density, rather low density water has low nutrient concentration as phytoplankton, as primary productivity proceeds. As it turns out, and as you guys know living here, that's also when the whales are here. So this is for the Gulf of Maine here. In the winter, you don't really have marine mammals in the Gulf of Maine. It's the summer when they're feeding most actively. They're actually breaking down that thermocline too. Through mechanical action, they can be affecting the thermocline by moving back and forth through it and also moving those nutrients at the surface. So more evidence that there's an ecological importance to this movement. But even during that first day, I realized something. I work on right whales. There are, at that time, maybe there were 450 North Atlantic right whales. So how really influential are they when they're at such small numbers? Of course, estimates are that there were 10,000 right whales before hunting began. So I showed you those slides for present populations, but what about past populations? What about before humans removed many of these out of the oceans? And now you see the big influence of whales. Rivers for this system were still the same. We don't have coastal point source 500 years ago. That is, you don't have sewage. Atmospheric deposition is much lower. It was about 20% nitrogen falling out of the atmosphere, which is elevated because of industrial activity, agricultural activities, much lower. And whale populations were much higher. These are, because Gisli had mentioned that earlier estimate for fin whales, and one of the reasons I asked him about it is I would argue that many scientists, there's still, again, some controversy about what historic numbers were for whales. So we did a scenario for the low abundance historically or high abundance, something that others have been working on using genetic means and other techniques to get at those historical numbers. So about 2 years ago, I've been discussing the role of nitrogen in that system. Someone who's been working on the movement of phosphorus by herbivores contacted me and said, do you think there's any connection between the movement of nutrients in whales also with the movement of nutrients onto the oceans, rather onto land? Many of you would be familiar with anadromous fish such as salmon moving onto land, and then they're spawning and breeding, and those nutrients, such as nitrogen, can be found growing in trees up to 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers away from the streams being moved by bears. Historically, if we looked at the movement of nutrients by whales historically, and then also looked at the number of anadromous fish that were in that system, the bears, scavengers, and herbivores, we find this phosphorus cycle that's much different from what we have today. One where phosphorus is moving around actually from the oceans onto land. Also, this can happen via seabirds. So we've been talking about trying to revitalize this phosphorus cycle. Right now, most of the phosphorus that we get is, at least in agricultural areas, I don't know about Iceland, but certainly in the US, is mined. So it's not a sustainable resource. That we may be at peak phosphorus right now. Could animals actually help move these nutrients around the planet and on land and up through the oceans? I don't know. But we think we're trying to work on that right now. And could there be some scheme where there might be some sort of a phosphorus fee that could bring back these species? I'm a conservation biologist. I'm mostly interested in the animals themselves. But here's a service or a potential role that the animals could do. So this is related, I think, to the paper that Gisli, there has been some work done on looking at whether blue whales and other great whales can sustain fisheries. That is there an offset between, in this case, they're consuming krill. Here's a recent drone image that just came out a couple of days ago showing a blue whale feeding on krill. And they're showing that the amount, in this case it's iron, the amount of iron they're bringing to the surface can cause an increase in primary productivity that would actually cause a net sequestration of carbon into the deep sea. You'll have a bloom. The carbon falls out, and that's enhancing the productivity in that area. This is back of the envelope that I did in my hotel room yesterday. I had been asked this for the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada. And so the average Icelander produces about 10 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Following their model, even though blue whales are now at maybe 2% of what they were historically in the southern hemisphere, they might be able to offset all the carbon produced by Iceland. So think about the carbon offset by these whales if we were to restore them as numbers come back. An enticing thought. So the policy part of this, I think, in a way, is that looking at the whale pump, the direct kill of whales in order to take them out because they're competition, that could be counterproductive because it could reduce primary productivity and even fish stocks. Again, we haven't made that connection all the way to fish stocks yet, but we've been working on primary productivity and are trying to look at krill now. So looking at evidence that the krill are consuming phytoplankton that's already been, that's been produced, at least that has the nitrogen that's coming from the whale. So here are the 4 ecological pathways that we've been thinking about. This is work that I've been doing with Jim Estes, Victor Smetichik out of Germany, Stephen Nicol from Australia, and several other colleagues. We got together after I had published that paper with Jim McCarthy and said, all right, we've been working on this nutrient transfer idea. What are the other ways? Well, Gisli's already been discussing the role of whales as predators. We also discussed their role as prey, and I'll talk about the study that Gisli showed earlier, whether it's from orcas or sharks. Historically, there would have been larger sharks. And then I'll discuss this in a moment, the role of carcasses and how important it is when whales die to deep sea ecosystems. So those are the basic 4 ecological pathways. And then 2 more that we can think of. 1 is the physical engineering of whales, and 2 is their effect on ecosystem resilience. In the interest of time, I won't talk about ecosystem resilience now, but I will show you 2 examples of physical engineering. One is, and those of you who've seen humpbacks here, is they produce bubble nets. And also, I was blown away when I first saw these images. These images here are from DTAG suction cups that were put on the back of humpback whales. I showed that first image, all we knew of a whale was when it was at its surface or on the shore. Now, with these new tags, it shows pitch, roll, has an acoustic, it has a hydrophone in it. We're really starting to understand what whales are doing beneath the surface. That's an image of a humpback whale producing what's called a bubble net. Basically, it's beneath, in this area, it would be sand lance. It's beneath a group of sand lance. It's going in this spiral fashion where you see the yellow there is when you can hear that it's exhaling. So it's releasing those bubbles, and then you could see the image here of the whales coming up in the middle of that bubble net. Now, I would argue they are doing ecosystem engineering in this case, but it's pretty short-lived. I mean, it's a matter of seconds. It may have an effect on the thermocline. But even though this, I think, is clear evidence, it is, again, pretty ephemeral. In contrast, the gray whales can have effects on the bottom, on the seabed off the coast of Alaska that can last for centuries. They're going into the mud looking for amphipods, and you can see those furrows that have been there for hundreds of years. So another example of physical changes. I think as humans, when we think of physical changes, we want to see it. We want to see that evidence there. It's still hard in pelagic systems for us maybe to find that evidence so clearly. So this is another way of showing the work that Gisli showed earlier. This is put together by Jim Estes, and I acknowledge this is pretty controversial, but this is one of the lead authors on this hypothesis that he had mentioned, shown in another way. So you have the orcas there. Historically, they would have fed on gray whales and humpback whales. Once the great whale fishery, this is for the North Pacific, came through, great whale populations declined, and orcas switched to the fur seals, harbor seals, and stellar sea lions. As those populations declined, as you saw in that earlier slide, orcas switched to sea otters, and that had a trophic cascade effect. So not only is it that slide, but sea otter populations declined, sea urchins, their main prey populations, increased, and that had an effect on the kelp forest there. Kelp forests were turned to urchin barrens. This is a classic example. Again, we could probably get 30 marine mammalogists in a room and could have a fist fight over whether this really happened or not. This got pretty ugly, honestly, and it's still pretty controversial. But I think it's an engaging hypothesis, and certainly what we're seeing is as great whale populations come back, increased predation on the great whales, on at least humpback calves, and predation on gray whales. It's believed one of the reasons that gray whales migrate is to avoid predation. That's one thought is why several of the baleen species migrate, is to get their calves out of the way, fatten them up, and then bring them back. What's really been some amazing work, I think, in the past 30 or 40 years, and this is work largely led by Craig Smith at the University of Hawaii, is looking at the effect of whales when they die on the deep sea. This is only, speculation was as far back as the 1970s, but really research has only occurred in about the past 20 years as we have remote vehicles that could go down there and look at these. This is a gray whale. A lot of the research on these has been done with whales that were intentionally sunk because they knew where they are. Think about finding, in English we would say needle in a haystack. I mean, trying to find dead whales in the ocean is not easy. So a lot of times it's ones that have been dropped down there. But these carcasses, or whale falls as we call them in English, provide habitat. Already we've discovered 60 species that are only found on those whale falls. And it also more than 300 other species. Macroinvertebrates, you can see some of them there. There are sea cucumbers there. This is the Osedax, or the bone-eating worm. Really an amazing creature. Doesn't have a mouth, doesn't have a gut, doesn't have an anus. It's in the bones, it's using the sulfides that are coming out of the bones, and has symbiotic bacteria inside. So it provides the energy to these microbes, and they convert it to sugar and feed that organism. Really, truly amazing organisms. And it's really cool, the work that's been done on these carcasses. They change over time. Here's another example, I think a good example of how even a dead animal can engineer an environment. So when they first fall out, you have this mobile scavenger stage, hagfish, sharks, anything eating that soft tissue. After that, the soft tissue's gone, you have enrichment opportunists, other species moving in. They're like, wow, there's a lot of energy here. And rather, there's a lot of food here. It's estimated that when a whale carcass falls, it's equivalent to about 2,000 years of just the fall that would come from marine snow or others. So it's a huge pulse. And then the really interesting stage, and I think why many people are fascinated, is the sulfophilic stage, where you have clams, Osedax, and other species that aren't digesting. They're just using their symbionts to survive there. So who knows how many bacteria are unique to these areas. And then finally, that reef stage, where basically it's the bones that are left there. And that can last hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So these communities are, which we didn't even know about until a few decades ago, are heavily dependent on these whale species. We did a model a couple of years ago, Craig Smith and a mathematician that he works with, looking at what's the effect of pulling whales out of the ecosystem on these communities, and found, this basically shows you going down either the reduction in length, so we originally took out the large species, so the individual habitat, that whale fall got smaller because blue whales, we eventually worked our way down to minke whales, smaller habitats and less common habitat. As anyone knows who studied basic ecology or biology, as we reduce the habitat, it's going to increase the chances of extinction. There are going to be fewer species. So we estimated some of the first extinctions in the oceans may have occurred on whale falls as we took out that habitat before we even know they existed. Good news is, as you all know, as we saw, whale populations are coming back. It looks like, in the North Pacific at least, that a lot of these species have made it through. We really haven't studied the North Atlantic as much yet to date. So talking about the biodiversity that's associated with dead whales, well, of course, we don't have large trees inland, rather in the oceans. We have trees, large trees on land. In the oceans, it's most of the primary producers are phytoplankton, but we do have large animals. Indeed, one of the largest animal ever to exist, the blue whale shown here. A colleague of mine, Andy Pershing, estimated how much carbon is sequestered through whale falls. So right now, about 30,000 tons of, it's probably higher now, this was back in 2010, 30,000 tons of carbon each year are sequestered by dead whales sinking into the deep sea and not returning. Historically, higher numbers, probably 200,000 tons of carbon. So this is an important form of carbon sequestration. How much does 200,000 tons of carbon, what does that mean? It's sort of like a reforestation scheme, maybe in an area, not that you would do it, but an area the size of Iceland or something like that. So it's significant, but it's not going to change the truth. By restoring whales, we're not going to stop climate change, but it might be one way, one other service that they provide. Lately, what we've been looking at, and this is work I know that Gisli and others have been doing, even though I'm showing the North Pacific here, is looking at the effects of migration. So here, humpbacks and I believe minkies, well, humpbacks are going to the Caribbean from here, is that right? And minkies maybe off the Azores. They do these large migratory patterns. They're feeding here, and then they're swimming down to low latitudes, which have low nutrients or oligotrophic. They die there too. Their calves die. They actually have placentas that are released into that area. And then nitrogen is passed out via urine. So they're releasing those nutrients into that area. We've called it the Great Whale Conveyor Belt. We've done some preliminary estimates for blue whales, for migratory blue whales. What would that mean? They could increase primary productivity in some oligotrophic areas by 50%, which is not insignificant. So some of our early models, again, this is our early, this is still very much in the early stage of our work. But the point is that they're not only moving nutrients up and down, but they're also moving it laterally. And in fact, whales have the longest mammalian migrations on the planet. So we've been talking about the ecological impact of species, but of course they also provide ecosystem services to people. What are ecosystem services? Basically, the benefits that nature provides for free by having wild animals or wild plants. I discussed a little bit about climate regulation already, and also about the enhanced biodiversity, those species that are only found on dead whales, the evolutionary potential. It's thought that whales are stepping stones for species to move between hydrothermal vents. So they're only the larvae are going out, settling on the whales, and then those larvae are going into those areas. We talked about enhanced primary productivity. As you all know, in Iceland, whale watching is big business around the world, $2 billion a year. That number is dated right now. I've heard maybe $30 million a year in Iceland alone. Provisioning services, eating whale, of course, has been something that people have been doing for thousands of years. And then I think that whales play a really important role alive in culture, and certainly has influenced the conservation movement as well. In the US, it's focused more on whale watching and marine stewardship, but all of these combined show that whales are worth a lot in the oceans. And recently, there was a resolution in the IWC acknowledging the role of whales in providing ecosystem services. Gisli's shown some of this rebound. I grew up in New York City. I never saw a whale there. In fact, I'm amazed that we've used this term lifting baselines. I never saw a whale growing up. And now there's whale watching, and you can see that's a real picture. That's the Empire State Building in the background. They're feeding on menhaden in New York Harbor, which is amazing. I mean, humpbacks really are like the conservation rock star, beyond being the rock star for whale watching communities. It's just, they're back in the North Pacific. In Western Australia, they were down to 600. Now they're 25,000 in the humpback. And we're starting to see changes in their behavior and also the behavior of other species. We could show quite a lot of other species as well this is true for. Not all. A lot of species are still suffering, like the North Atlantic right whale, still at low numbers, still severely threatened. But several species are really, baleen whales are a good example of conservation at work. That doesn't mean our work is done. Certainly in the United States, we may not whale, but we kill whales unintentionally. They get run over by ships. They get caught in fishing gear. And this shows you the work of one of my colleagues, Dave Wiley, and also the role that whale watching can do. You see up here what's called a heat map. So areas in red show where whale density is the highest, and in blue, density is lowest. And that box there, that's a national marine sanctuary that we have called Stellwagen. That black rectangle there is the shipping channel going into Boston. So what do you see? This is that solid bar is the shipping channel went right through the area where whales are most common. They were running over humpbacks and right whales, which are federally protected. So there was concern that, one, the shipping could injure or even cause the further extinction or move the species to closer extinction. The cool thing is with that data, you can see that dotted line, there's an alternative. It added about 5 to 10 minutes of shipping time. Moving up, taking that dogleg in with that data has resulted in local shipping companies and indeed the International Maritime Organization moving that shipping lane into that area, reducing the chance of ship strikes by at least 60% in that area. Shows you what you can do with spatial data and even working with whale watching and other groups. And with that, I will show you a picture from my daughter who says, whale poop rocks. And so she's a big supporter. Her friends call me a whale poopologist. Thank you.